All right, well, then we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. Oh, awesome. Can you do the next page? We're homeschooling this morning. We're having webinars. We're working from home. We're sheltering in. Oh, it's busy even though we're sheltered in. So
it's second grade math.
Yes, go sit down. That's my son Flint, and we're homeschooling this morning. And
about the second grade math.
And he's having a tough time. But welcome everyone. Thanks for joining our second webinar in our series, Dig Into Your Day with Cover Crops and Conservation. Welcome back for those that attended the webinar on Monday. Today, our speaker is Peter Tomlinson. He's an associate professor and extension specialist for environmental quality in the Agronomy Department at Kansas State University. He completed his graduate work at the University of Arkansas, and now he's conducting applied research and extension, focusing on ag best management practices on soil health, nutrient dynamics, and water and air quality. So welcome, Peter. Thanks for giving the webinar today.
Thank you for the invitation, and look forward to the discussion with your group.
All right.
This is kind of bringing me back closer to where I grew up. Down in Connecticut from junior high through high school and college, and my undergraduate work was done at the University of Connecticut, and had a opportunity to spend some time in Vermont as an animal science student looking at dairies across Vermont and New England. So excited to have the opportunity to share some of the work we have going on in Kansas with you all this morning. And we'll get the share started here. All right. I think we should be in slide mode now. So wanted to take the opportunity to share with the group about some work that we have going on with regards to cover crops in a corn soybean rotation. And so as we think about why we might want to incorporate cover crops into our cropping systems, we can, I think the good starting place here is to think about, where are we at in terms of our fertilizer use. And, as we look at this on a national perspective, one of the ways to get at this is to look at fertilizer sales and how much fertilizer we're selling in the U.S. Interestingly, in terms of phosphorus, phosphorus use has been fairly steady or fairly constant, and we've continued to see a fairly steady increase in terms of the amount of nitrogen that we're using. And so why is this important to think about in terms of integrating cover crops into our cropping system? Well, as we think about, how do we tighten up the nutrient cycling in our cropping systems? How do we just tighten up that overall nutrient utilization? Cover crops provide one of those opportunities. And so there was a interesting review paper done in 2013 that looked at different management strategies in terms of their effect on controlling nitrogen leaching. And we can see that, cover crop use highlighted in the red bar has had a positive effect on reducing nitrogen leaching. However, it's interesting when we dive a little bit deeper into this, what you select as your cover crop does play an important role in how effective it is at controlling nitrogen leaching. And so we can see, hopefully my pointer is showing on your screen, we can see that non-legume cover crops really had the most effect on reducing that end leaching, keeping that nitrogen tied up in the system and not lost out of the bottom of our rooting zones. Whereas our legume cover crops really had a neutral effect, neither positive nor negative on nitrogen leaching, and a wide much wider range in terms of the legumes. And then we can come over to the phosphorus side of the equation. And there's been this trend developing that in our long-term no-till systems, we're seeing more dissolved phosphorus loss out of those systems. This panel here looks at continuum of tillage or conservation methods going from conventional to no-till, and we see this trend of increasing dissolved phosphorus loss in no-till. And then we can come over and look at some of this data out of Lake Erie, and we can see that we've continued to see a decrease in sediment, decrease and now leveling off in total P, but really beginning in about 1995, we started to see this increased in dissolved reactive phosphorus in Lake Erie. So, all of these pieces come together and really highlight what we can do in our cropping systems, and then this challenge in our agricultural landscape of how do we keep that our valuable soil in place in our fields, reduce erosion as highlighted here, and the sediment that's leaving through this flume at our water quality project. How do we keep that out of our lakes and reservoirs? How do we maintain high quality water for all of the societal uses, from recreation to drinking water? And so, with that as a context, in 2014, we set up the Kansas Agricultural Watershed Field Laboratory. This is a large project, covers about 19 acres. We've had a number of graduate students that have, David Abel completed his master's, Elliot Carver completed his master's and has stayed on for his PhD on the project, and Laura Starr and Catherine Stewart are both current PhD students working on this site. And so each watershed here is about 1.2 to 1.5 acres. And so, we're moving beyond the small plot into a larger representation of fields on the landscape. And so as we think about our cropping cycle here, it's corn soybean rotation, and in 2015, 16 was our soybean year. Fall of 2015, we planted winter wheat as our cover crop. Part of our thought here was we're looking for low cost cover crops that could be effective. And then we terminated that, planted our cash crop of soybeans in early June. And then that was harvested in mid-October of 2016. And so what you'll see here, and what's pretty common across the state of Kansas, is that our soybeans tend to go in after corn is planted, and they're harvested after corn is planted. As you move further north, again, soybeans will go in after corn is planted, but typically it'll get harvested before corn. So, Kansas and Missouri are a bit unique, as well as further south, in terms of seeing the corn planted first and coming off first. And so it does provide some unique opportunities when we think about cover crops. In our corn year, we planted triticale and rapeseed mix after the soybeans were harvested, and you can see that we're getting a bit late in our cover crop planting window. In fall of 16, we got that planted in mid-October, And you know, typically by the 1st of November, we're going to have a killing frost. So, you know, we do have a cool season grass here, but you know, we're probably with less than a 30-day growing window. And then we're going to be terminating that cover crop fairly early in the spring as well. So cover crop was terminated and corn was planted by the 27th of March. And then that corn was harvested again in September. And so you can see that, you know, our best opportunity to get a cover crop in this rotation and get good growth is following corn harvest ahead of soybean planting. And so let's look at where we're at in terms of some yield data from this project. So at 2016 soybean, we saw no effect of the cover crop on our grain yield. In terms of corn, in 17 we did see a decrease in our corn yield with the cover crop. I think some of this was related to a cool soil conditions, but also likely a nitrogen limitation. And so as you see in 19 here, we bumped up our pre-plant nitrogen a little bit with that, or our at planting nitrogen with the corn, and we were able to minimize or eliminate any negative effect of that cover crop. In terms of the 2018 soybean, this is a very low soybean yield. This was a severe drought year. We had no measurable runoff and really no measurable precipitation from late October, around the time that the cover crops were planted, until the following September, late August, early September of that year. And so the fact that we were able to even harvest soybeans was good. And then with this project, we do have phosphorus fertilizer management component overlaid with and without cover crop management. And we can see that, you know, in our soybean years, you know, we may be seeing a little bit of benefit from the phosphorus fertilizer here. As we've built our soil phosphorus levels, we're now approaching 30 parts per million malic 3 on a 6-inch soil sample. We're really not seeing an effect. Now that could also be an affected drought. We'll see where we're at with this coming soybean year. But we do see a positive response out of our corn years from some phosphorus application. In terms of phosphorus uptake by our crop, you know, no effect in 2016, and then beginning in 2017, we started to see this interesting trend, and we're still not sure what to make of it, but we are seeing a bit of a decrease in P uptake by our cash crops where we have cover crops present in the mix. And then, you know, as we'd expect, where we're adding phosphorus fertilizer to this system, we're seeing a positive response. But that interaction isn't coming out. We're seeing these as main effects of P fertilizer application and the main effect of cover crop treatment. So in terms of thinking about P uptake and cycling, we've been looking at how the nutrients are partitioning out as we think about these broader nutrient management questions and challenges. So we've been applying about 54 pounds of P2O5 per acre. And in terms of soybean, we can see that, you know, approaching 2/3 of that of the phosphorus will be found in the grain, the rest in the residue, and you know that is in pretty close balance with the phosphorus fertilizer that we're applying. In terms of the corn crop, is removing about 90, 85 pounds of P2O5, but then we're returning close to 50 pounds of that in residue that's being decomposed on the soil surface. And so, as we start to think about phosphorus stratification in these systems, there is a lot of P being posited at the surface in that as that residue decomposes. Grain P removal in the corn is pretty comparable to what we're seeing for P removal with our soybeans. And then we've also looked at, in terms of the cover crop biomass, how does that play into this? And so our control would be those treatments that don't have any phosphorus applied, but do have a cover crop. And then we've got cover crop fertilized. And so we do see a little bit more P uptake and cycling in those cover crops where we've got phosphorus fertilizer being added to the system. Not surprising, we have more P in the system, so not surprising that the cover crops are pulling up more of that phosphorus. Just some other pieces to think about that tie into this project. Interestingly, having every watershed isolated, being able to capture the amount of runoff leaving, how that runoff is leaving. We're learning a lot about the surface water flow dynamics. One of the interesting things that we found and has been very consistent through this study is we're not changing, at least given the conditions of this site, we've not changed the total amount of runoff. So we have the same amount of runoff leaving the site, but it does, where we've planted the cover crops, and I don't have the graph in the slides today, that water does leave slower. So we've decreased the intensity of the runoff, and we've lengthened the duration of the runoff. But the end result, when we look at that on an overall water year, is we have the same amount of runoff leaving the plots, whether we have cover crops or not in the system. That just behaves differently. And I think that ties into what we're seeing here is a very consistent trend of decreased erosion with the addition of cover crops into the system. So, we've already done a great job of reducing erosion by converting to no-till. In that, we've cut 75 to 80%, and now that we add cover crops, we're seeing an additional 60 to 70% reduction in erosion. So, highlights a real opportunity there for cover crops. Just in terms of some other cover crop effects on the soils and the biological components of these systems, we've seen this consistent trend that adding cover crops into the system, we've increased total carbon, and this is at the very near surface, so the top inch. We've increased total nitrogen, we've increased total P, we've increased like 3P, and we're tracking positive changes in the soil biological community. So increased microbial biomass is a coarse measure of biological, the amount of biology, bacteria, fungi, increased microbial respiration. So we can think about this as an indication of the activity of the system, and then looking at some specific enzymes related to phosphorus cycling. We're seeing increased alkaline and acid phosphatase activities at the, this is now the top 2 inches, but that top surface where we have a lot of the dynamics going on. And so, just some summary points here. In terms of soybeans, no effect of adding the cover crop into the system on our soybean yields. This is really what we see as one of our greatest opportunities to get cover crops integrated into a corn soybean rotation in the Central Great Plains. Positive effect from cover crops on decreased sediment, particulate peat loss, positive effects on soil health, but we do need to be cautious about the increases in dissolved phosphorus that we're seeing. And so, this kind of thing is one way to think about cover crops and soybeans. And as Heather and I were talking about 2 weeks ago, wanted to also share some work that we have going where we've actually looked at using soybean as a fairly inexpensive cover crop opportunity as well. And so we also have had a long-term cropping systems and cover crop study. Its focus has been cover crops between wheat and sorghum or milo, traditional crop rotation here in Kansas that has some large windows where we can get crops, where we can insert cover crops, particularly in central and eastern Kansas. We could easily replace that sorghum with corn. But again, it highlights that, when we can get a small grain into the rotation, we do have some greater opportunities to bring cover crops and have a longer window to get cover crop growth. So we've got a nitrogen rate component nested into this study as well. We've been subsurface banding, 28% UAN, again, really trying to optimize our nitrogen management in this project, getting that nitrogen below the residue layer and reducing immobilization of that nitrogen so that we're maximizing how much nitrogen is available to the sorghum crop. And so harvest winter wheat usually in mid-June. What we've done in this project is we've allowed the first flush of volunteer wheat to come up. We then terminated that. That would be good best management practice for small grain production to reduce disease carryover, and particularly having a heavy amount of volunteer wheat as we get into the next wheat planting season and carryover of a number of diseases. So in this project, we've had, it was all single species, just trying to piece out individual components that could go into a cover crop mix. We've had crimson clover, forage soybeans, double crop soybeans, sorghum Sudan grass, and daikon radish. And what we've seen is where we have a high C to N ratio, high residue cover crop, we've reduced our yields and it's required more nitrogen. So this red line is our sorghum Sudan grass. We're requiring an additional 40 units of nitrogen to get our yields back to where we're not seeing a yield impact from that cover crop. Again, this I think ties back to the previous study and thinking about corn. But the way that we've approached in this project to put a value on these cover crops as we think about them from a nutrient return standpoint is to calculate our nitrogen fertilizer replacement value. And so the way that we do this is because we've got that nitrogen ramp in the study, we're able to basically take our chem fallow or traditional system where we don't have cover crops. We can develop a response curve for the nitrogen additions and then plug the yield response of our cover crops where we haven't added any additional N back into that and derive a potential credit And so when we look at this over an 8-year period, you know, in terms of fertilizer nitrogen equivalent credits, that double crop soybean, which we have harvested and removed grain out of, really that with our winter legume and non-legume cover crops were a push, or neutral. But our summer legume, over 8 years, we were able to see about a 30-pound nitrogen credit. And that summer non-legume, that high biomass, high C/N cover crop cost us nitrogen somewhere in that neighborhood here. When we worked the math out, it was 45 pounds of N per acre, but somewhere in that 40 to 50 units of N needed to overcome having that high residue biomass. Now, as far as how frequently were we pushing cover crops in this rotation, which was wheat, sorghum, soybean, we only had cover crops between wheat and sorghum, so once every 3 years. So kind of unique, but just thought I'd take the opportunity to share this work with you this morning. You know, and again, you know, this kind of flipping the tables, but we might consider a late maturing soybean as a legume opportunity that we can take advantage of if we're looking to fix some nitrogen for that next crop. And so with that, I thank everybody for their time this morning, and I am happy to take any questions.
Great. That was very informative and really well aligned with some of the work that we're doing here as well. So thank you. I think everybody will see we launched a quick poll, and if you could take a minute and answer some of the questions, that would be great. And if you have questions for Peter, let's get those in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we will start answering those. So thanks for doing the quick poll. We appreciate that. So Peter, the first question I see here is, how are you terminating your cover crops in the long-term wheat and sorghum study?
Yep. So in the long-term wheat and sorghum study, we've used a variety of termination approaches. The sorghum Sudan grass, that high biomass residue cover crop, we have terminated with a roller crimper just prior to flowering, and that typically has been a dwarf brown midrib Sudan grass that we've used in that rotation. The late maturing soybeans, we have rolled those on some occasions where we've started to see some pod set, but typically it's been a combination of rolling and freezing temperatures. The daikon radish, we've allowed most years that has terminated with freezing, although we do, just as a cleanup in the spring, we do a chemical termination as well, just to make sure we don't have any misses in that.
Sorry, I muted myself there. Let's get in some other questions if people have questions. Okay, not seeing too many questions. People are pretty quiet this morning. Everybody's still waking up. Let's see here. I don't know. People are quiet. People are quiet. All right, the polls are coming in. Oh. Well, fascinating research. We're talking a lot about phosphorus in Vermont as well. So I think people not talking about it. We've been dealing with, shouldn't even say that. Like it's, you know, just we're chatting about it. But
yes.
yeah,
I
I
could have
know.
done 30 minutes on cover crops and phosphorus and the challenges there, and
Yeah.
with a background in animal science, when you add in manure, that adds a whole complicating factor into the equation as well.
Yeah, I know. Well, so we are a phosphorus, dealing with phosphorus management on many of our, use the markers, on many of our farms too. So it's very relevant to us. Do you have a ballpark on pricing for the roller crimper? It always has seemed way out of our budget.
I do not have a ballpark on that. It was a Chevron crimper, and we were able to actually partner with our plant materials center that's located right by the right by where we're doing this work, and so I do not have a sense of what the price is on those.
Yeah, I think when we bought ours through H&J Manufacturing, it was $7,500 for a 10-foot crimper. I know that there are designs online. I know the Rodale developed a version that you could build yourself, and there's a few of those online. So I know there's been a couple of farms, at least in Vermont, and others that I know of that have also built their own. So if you're a do-it-yourselfer, I think you'd be able to probably build one, probably cheaper. But yeah. So we have a question in as well. We are a small scale school farm. For terminating cover crop, have you ever experimented with burning in the spring instead of chemical use?
Have not tried burning the cover crop off in the spring. Again, we're trying to keep as much residue on that soil surface as possible. That being said, in the tall grass prairie region of Kansas, and we do have a lot of acres of native grass that are burned annually to maintain that native prairie and reduce the amount of invasion of brush and cedars. So, it certainly could be an option to consider, but I'd be worried about keeping that soil surface protected as much as possible.
Yeah, and if anybody that's an attendee has any suggestions for Matt, he's in Randolph. He's got a school farm there, and actually all his students are supposed to be attending the webinars. This is part of their online programming. So if anybody has any suggestions for them, please type them in the chat box, and he'll be able to see those. So, Peter, did you attribute the lack of additional yield in soybeans to the fact that they fix nitrogen?
I'm not sure that I fully understand that question. Our in the first year for our area, the soybean yields with and without cover crops were in the area that we would expect. Pretty representative of a dryland cropping system. And then 18 was the drought year, so everything was challenged that year. I mean, there were a lot of acres that were zeroed out in terms of crop insurance. So not sure that I'm getting an answer to that question, but.
Okay, well, if there's any clarification there that it looks like Clara, you could provide, that'd be great. And we have another question. Do you think in the longer term that soil health benefits would improve the cash crop yields or even out yield, especially in those kind of adverse years like a drought year? And I'm surprised that rain infiltration did not improve with cover crops.
So let me take that question into a couple pieces. You know, I think that certainly as we can build surface residue and protect that soil surface, we do have some opportunities. And in that long-term cover crop study, when that was going on through the a drought period that we had in 2011 and 12, we did see some positive effects. Actually, it was the 1 year that the high residue cover crop that typically has negatively impacted our cash crop yields really paid off, and we attribute that to a moisture conservation effect of that higher amount of residue on the surface. In terms of the infiltration, we have done a lot of thinking about this, and it's, you know, I think that we do have probably more near surface infiltration, but what we need to do is step back and think about our soil profile and the characteristics of our soils. This site has a infiltration limiting BT, so an increase in clay content at about 12 to 14 inches. That's pretty typical of a lot of soils in the eastern part of Kansas. And so I think we have affected some near surface infiltration, but you know, once that profile is saturated, you know, we're not able to capture any more precip in that system. And then we have, you know, and I think this is where it comes into play when it ties back into phosphorus, is then we have a lot of near surface infiltration, interflow, and return flow happening. And so with the phosphorus stratification that we've seen develop, then that is our opportunity, or why we're seeing the phosphorus loss tied with that. You know, if things have been really dry, there are a handful of occasions each year that we'll see less runoff with the cover crop plots. You know, if we've got actively growing cover crops that have pulled water out of the system, we may see more infiltration there and reduced runoff. But overall, you know, that's then balanced by, once that cover crop's terminated, if it's holding more moisture, we can actually see increased runoff where we have the cover crops. And so, you know, when we look at that on an annualized basis is where we get to, you know, that we're just not seeing a change in the total amount of water running off or leaving that system. That isn't to say that we don't have a lot of infiltration, interflow and return flow, or water interactions going on in the system, and we're definitely changing the speed with which that water leaves where we have the cover crop. It leaves much slower, and we've been able to document that.
Great. Perfect. Well, we're coming up at the end of our time, and so if there's any final questions or comments, please type those in. I don't know, Peter, if you have anything else you'd like to say or share. Yeah.
Just thank you, Heather, for the opportunity to present this morning, and hope that everybody has a good day and stays safe and healthy in this interesting time that we're all in.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks for getting online first thing this morning, and same to you. Stay safe and keep telling, like, sane.
Yes.
And socially distanced and sanitized. I mean, it's like the 3 S's. I feel like now I end all my emails, instead of, you know, have a good day or whatever, stay safe, sanitized, and socially distanced. And not that that's funny. It's real, and I think we're all trying to do our part. So
Right.
thank you so much, and for our attendees, thanks for attending. These are starting to be posted already on our website. So I think Catherine, right, the first one is up there already.
Yep, it's on the Northwest Crop Soils YouTube channel, and then also available on our website on the Cover Crops page. So it's right front and center when you go to that page.
Great. And so Monday, we're going to have Rob Myers with us, and he's going to be talking about cover crop profitability. So until then, everyone, enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Have a great day.
Thanks,
You too,
Peter.
Heather. Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thanks.